everybody. In this video, we are talking about women in colonial Latin America. The chapter you read gives you a lot of information here, but I'm going to highlight a few things for you. Of course, I also have some images up, and I think that'll really add to kind of what you read for today. So this entire unit that we're working on is on the colonial period in the Americas, okay? Things are quite different between North America and South and Central America. So we're going to be starting here in Latin America because chronologically the conquest and the colonization started there. Also, it's kind of a nice, smooth transition from the Spanish mystics we learned about in the last couple of weeks. All right. So we're going to see some real similarities between some of the religious practices between Spain and then the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, especially regarding religious women. Okay. But you will also see how Latin American Catholicism becomes distinct from its Iberian form. Okay. Now, if I'm going to speak of generalizations here, Latin America is very Catholic, and the British or American colonies are very Protestant, though of course there is some limited Protestantism in Latin America. And actually, this is a growing trend today. And of course, there was Catholicism in the early American colonies as well. Okay, so I have a map of colonial Latin America in the year 1800. Okay, so right here we are on kind of the cusp of revolution in Latin America. The Haitian Revolution ends in 1804, and that is the revolution that kind of sets things off in the region. Okay, now you can see in this map, Spain still has a lot of large swaths of land that they're controlling. And of course, Brazil here is a massive Portuguese holding. And then there's some other scattered possessions through the region. There are many similarities between Spanish and Portuguese, Latin America, though I'll occasionally point out some differences when they warrant mention. Okay. Now, a few things to talk about before we get going. In Latin America, there's this incredible blending of cultures and peoples. All right, there are indigenous people coming from a variety of different cultures. There are the Europeans who are specifically coming from the Iberian Peninsula, and then there's the Africans who are being brought over forcibly as slaves. Okay, and of course, the African slaves came from a variety of different cultures and countries as well, though the Yoruba culture becomes particularly prevalent in the Americas. Okay, so you have this great diversity. But then there's this really, really strict class system based on race, okay? This is a topic we talk about in history too, so I don't want to talk about it too much here, but I want to make note because a woman's race and class significantly influences her experiences and opportunities in Latin America, okay? So for the indigenous populations, they suffered massive population losses when the Spanish and Portuguese arrived. I have some more examples in your chapter because the losses were not uniform, but we're probably looking at about 85% of the indigenous population dying from disease and other causes. Okay. And then, of course, the ones that do survive are very much marginalized by these European colonizers. So yes, there are examples of indigenous women who integrated into kind of this new European American culture that's being created at this time. But that was kind of more the exception than the norm. And then, of course, enslaved women's experiences depended a lot on where she was located. In the Caribbean, women often worked side by side with men on plantations. In South American cities, they would largely be doing domestic tasks. Now, I really want to point something out here. This is a society that is completely functioning on slave labor, okay? Millions of slaves were brought to Latin America. And you see slaves in kind of more roles than you do in North America. Some were skilled laborers, some domestic servants, some were forced to serve in the military, some even oversaw other slaves, okay? They may have assisted in religious matters. Yes, there was clergy, and almost all the clergy was white at this point in time. It doesn't stay that way. Who owned slaves, okay? And it would not be unusual for especially wealthy nuns to come into a convent with servants and slaves with her. Okay. And then the women of European descent had a much more privileged position in society, but they were also very, very restricted. Okay, generally speaking, they married, and European Americans did have the highest marriage rate in the colonies, or they would enter a convent. Okay, middle class or poor white women may have learned a trade or worked outside of the home. Okay, and then finally here, just a note that there is a distinct type of Catholicism that was brought to the Americas, the Spanish Catholicism that's kind of forged in the Reconquista, okay? But it is transformed in the Americas. And then certain aspects of American Catholicism are then transferred back to Europe. Obviously, the Virgin of Guadalupe here is a prime example of this. While this particular image has had the most impact on the Americas, it has influenced the church as a whole. Okay, so I don't want you to kind of think about religion as this like one-way conduit from Europe to the Americas. Okay, yes, Christianity comes with the Europeans, but then it's transformed and then transferred back. Okay, so Latin American Catholicism has had profound impact on the church at large. Okay, let's talk a little bit about monastic women and beatas. All right. So we are going to talk about these two different kind of religious lifestyles in the Americas. And there is some fluidity between these roles, but they are distinct. So let's start with the monastics. Because in most ways, Latin American convents continued in this tradition of European convents, okay? There are two major types, the discalced and the calced convents. The term discalced literally means barefoot because monks or nuns would have either gone barefoot or wore sandals. But the term really implies a strict adherence to the monastic rules, okay? So if you remember, Teresa of Avila formed discalced convents in her attempt to reform the Carmelite order, okay? Now, the calced convents were a little more relaxed, you could say, all right? So let's start with these discalced convents. Generally speaking, you did not have to be as wealthy to join one of these communities. So in theory, these convents would have been more open to more women. However, they were very, very strict, and the nuns that lived there kind of tended towards extreme forms of penance, and they were not terribly popular, all right? Now, the calced convents had a much more loose interpretation of their monastic rules, and women were allowed far more freedoms, and these convents became very, very popular. You will see enormous monastic communities here, okay? Some of these convents house literally hundreds of nuns, plus servants, slaves, staff, orphans, students, various other women, women needing protection. Some nuns let family members live with them in their spacious cells, which could actually be like multi-story apartments, okay? There's this convent down in Peru that had over 1,000 inhabitants, and it took up a block and a half, okay? So these were really, really big communities and pretty self-sustaining communities as well, okay? Now, there were nuns that had genuine religious vocations. I am not going to imply otherwise. But some of them just found this preferable to marriage, okay? And over time, some of these large convents did deteriorate a little bit in kind of their vows, maybe a little morally. I give some examples in the chapter of women who are keeping all these servants and slaves. Some are refusing to wear monastic garb, or they're decorating their habits with like jewels. They had lots of parties and entertained guests. I think my favorite example is when this bishop tried to reprimand, a convent for keeping bulls within the convent walls so they could stage their own bullfights for entertainment. Okay. But it's kind of funny to think about, these nuns just having these big parties and things. But in a sense, you can hardly blame them in a sense. Like their options were marriage, and really, it would have been a marriage to probably somebody who's significantly older that they did not love, okay, arranged by their families, or a monastery. If they didn't want to marry, this was kind of their option, and clearly some of them just wanted to make the best of it, okay? Um, so you also read about Sor Juana Inez de la Cruz for today. She's by far the best known nun of the era. And one of the questions I have with her is always like, would have she been a nun had she had other options? Okay. If she had been allowed to go to the University of Mexico like she wanted, if she could have been an independent scholar, if she could have like held a professorship or something, you know, that I don't know. I don't know. Okay. Speaking of her, I put up a couple of poems on Moodle so you can read them. One has both the English and the Spanish. One just has English, but you will get a feel kind of for her literary works there. All right, now let's talk a little bit about beatas. All right, beatas are kind of on the other extreme here. If you remember the Beguines from History 1, there are certain similarities between beatas and Beguines, though beatas did not live in community like Beguines did. Beatas were laywomen, though some were tertiaries to monastic orders. If you don't know, tertiary is someone who's associated with the monastic order, but they do not live kind of in community or cloistered with the order, okay? The most famous of these beatas is Rosa de Lima. Okay, here she is on Peru's money. Can you even imagine a nun on U.S. currency? Sor Juana is on Mexican currency as well. But anyway, so Rosa was quite extreme. Her family were Creoles of modest means. Creole means European descent, people of European descent that are born in the Americas. Okay, and she was born in 1586, and from a very young age felt the call to a religious life, but she did not want to live in a convent. Okay, so instead, she builds a hut in her backyard where she lives and she surrounds herself with other religious women. Okay, and Rosa practices some of the most extreme forms of like self mortification, including wearing a crown with like metal spikes and kind of other forms of self torture. You know, you know, you will see this kind of throughout Latin America and kind of the saints and these holy women practicing these very, very extreme forms of penance, okay? Like in the case of Rosa, she actually hid it from her family and her confessor because they were very upset that she did that. But other people kind of just, you know, her followers and other people in the city were very, very impressed with these practices. Okay, kind of they considered her a living saint, and this is kind of part of that whole lifestyle. Okay. Generally speaking, convents were not open to women of color, so being a beata was kind of one of the only options to be kind of devote yourself to the religious life. Okay. So on the screen, I have Ursula de Jesus in the middle, and she was a really well-known mystic who lived first as a slave and then a servant in a convent. Like Rosa, she practiced very extreme forms of penance in Lima. The two were actually contemporaries, though Rosa died when Ursula was only 13. So Ursula was born into slavery and lived in the home of a very well-known mystic in the city of Lima. Okay, so then when she was 13, she moves from that home to a convent where she is serving a very young nun there. So basically, like the monastic life and religious fervor is all she ever knew. Okay. Now, while living in the convent, she has a very dramatic kind of conversion experience. And at that point, she devotes her life to praying, to penance. And her particular ministry was very much like praying for those in purgatory to lessen their time in purgatory. Okay. And then here on the bottom, we have Catarina de San Juan, and she lived in Puebla. It's really hard to disentangle kind of fact from fiction in her history, but it does seem that she was from India. She was likely kidnapped and forced into slavery. And during some time there when she was young, she converted to Christianity, and she was very closely associated with the Jesuits. She lived for many years as a slave, was eventually freed, and a benefactor bought her a room across the street from a Jesuit church. And she supported herself by sewing, making chocolate. And she really follows in the tradition of Christian mystics as well. She gained quite a following. Immediately after her death, there was a big push for canonization, but it faltered for a number of reasons. I talk about it in the chapter. If you want to know more, do your reading. but but with local figures like this, they'll kind of gain a big following in their communities. Sometimes there's a push for canonization. Sometimes not. In the case, like in her case, when the canonization process faltered, she's still like known as kind of a local holy woman, but obviously she doesn't have like the international renown that like Rosa de Lima did, who did gain canonization. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to wrap things up here on our video on women in Latin America. But if you have any questions about any of the content, feel free to shoot me an email. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.